So, thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure. Always enjoyed talking about teaching. And it's usually to a mixture of audience, either extremely enthusiastic about teaching or extremely wary about someone telling me how to teach or what to do. I'm not going to tell anyone how to teach, but I want to share with you a thinking process that has been going on in my mind, a lot of it joined with discussions with people like Alvin about the role of large lectures. Now, large lectures, of course, we're talking about this. Oh no, sorry, that must be an old picture, right? Because lectures these days look like this. So not that much different, you see. Perhaps the shirt lengths have changed. But so the first observation is really that lectures these days and today, to a large extent, not with everyone, not for every subject, are really unchanged. And what does typically happen in a lecture, and I'm mainly talking when I think about my colleagues in my department and what I know, and of course know less about our colleagues in other departments, but I guess we are not so unrepresentative in Manchester. The lecture is used as the main vehicle with which to convey material that is covered in the course. And that is mainly done by a lecturer presenting, much like I do right now. And then usually what happens, the lecture tends to be the first point of contact with new material, and then students are sent away after the lecture with a bunch of extra reading, and then please go to the tutorial, there are extra questions, and then sort of extend your knowledge on the topic, but with the lecture as a starting point. And sometimes there will be coursework, but usually coursework will only happen for particular aspects of a course, not for the course as a whole. So in some sense, I'm asking the question, is the lecture, at least the lecture as this just described, is it outdated? Now, one part of my answer to this is yes, and then of course the world isn't easy, and there's also a no. So I think yes, because mainly of the following aspect. I think both students and staff put too much weight to lectures. Lectures are way too important in the entire whole of how we deliver material. So often you will find that, and there are two indications of this. Firstly, very often students feel that everything, if I just know what's in the lecture, that will carry me through, give me at least a decent grade, okay, at the end. And perhaps more worryingly from our perspective, who is here, I don't know whether you remember taking over a course from someone else. So how does that usually work? The new lecturer goes to the previous lecturer and says, so what do you do? And the previous lecturer says, I just give you my lecture slides. And that sort of, and the understanding here is this is what defines the course unit. And then so you take the lecture slides, you do your changes and look at the exercises a bit and change that. But it's like the lecture slides are the core of the course, the definition of the course. I think that's problematic, and I'll argue why I think that is so. The no part of this answer is because really lectures are a fantastic opportunity to actually meet your students. And they are a regular opportunity for students to actually come to class and at least for 2 hours in their schedule, have a regular 2 hours in their schedule to engage with material. And they really offer an opportunity, and I would argue we are not using that enough, for you to actually engage with students. Now, how that, of course, is incredibly difficult, especially if we are talking about very large lecture theatres. And Humberto will later talk about an example of what he does actually in lectures as a way of engaging with students. And perhaps the very last point here, and from a perspective perhaps like people in a position like Alvin, that's possibly a quite important one. Lectures are actually a very cheap way of delivering contact hours. And contact hours, at least in Britain, these sort of statistics about degrees become quite important. Universities have to publish how many contact hours do you have as a student. and this is just the cheapest way of delivering contact hours. So lectures, scheduled lectures, it's very unlikely that they're going to disappear in the near future, and partly because universities, my guess is, will be very reluctant to give up on lectures, although there are some counter examples of universities who are making that step. So what has actually changed, let's say, in the last 20 years that may want us or puts us in a position to perhaps reconsider whether what we have been doing in lectures is still appropriate or not? Has something changed that gives us new opportunities? And I put that into 4 categories here. Firstly, technology has changed. We have new technology that facilitates in-class interaction between students and between staff, in-class voting systems. I'm not going to talk about this today. I'm sure you've all seen examples of clickers and talks about clickers. We have video recording facilities which are really easy, and I'll show you an example in a moment. That's what I use a lot. The role here is not what to do in the lecture here. I'll show you what the role of that is going to be. There's also lecture podcasts. Lectures are being recorded. At my institution, most lectures are being recorded, are available for students afterwards. That should potentially change of how we use the lecture. There's competition. I should perhaps put that in inverted commas, but there's MOOCs. And MOOCs are important because they have shown us how to do education differently. A lot of my thinking started when I was a student, I enrolled on a MOOC. I did that to learn a programming language, and that's sort of quite different challenge to teaching economics. But and does anyone know, by show of hands, who knows what MOOCs are? Okay. Has anyone of you been a student on a MOOC? You, okay. So I don't know how it was for you. For me, it was really transformational in my thinking about my own teaching, realizing how MOOCs manage to teach. It's not all perfect, okay, but certain aspects of that. So I really recommend, in some way, if there's one thing you take away from here, go away and enroll in a MOOC and learn something you're interested in. If you don't, and you will find some MOOC that does something you're really interested in. Then also, I leveled that here, material, and perhaps, certainly at Manchester, many of you may have heard about the Post-Crash Economic Society, which originated in Manchester. Pesky students are actually demanding now to be taught what matters and what is relevant. Good on them, and thank you. But that then illustrates that often our textbooks don't really deliver what we then want. Now, Alvin is going to describe an effort by CORE, quite a good effort, I think, to change that. But it's very clear that we, in our teaching, will have to usually go beyond what is in textbooks. Yes?
You should also include that people have laptops like him, and then don't listen to you.
That's absolutely right. Is he serving the internet? Yeah. And other people, and importantly, are the people behind you distracted by him? Yeah. Yes?
I had the same reaction first when a smartphone came into the class, and I had the same feeling when I was teaching and a student was there, and so I said, please can you switch off your phone? He said, but I'm taking notes on my phone. It's really not...
And you can't check it. I think it's a losing. If you were to fight that battle, it would be a losing battle. That's my personal view. There may be. That's the.
But you can also ask questions and then they answer with their phones.
That's right. They're based. And as I said, I personally, I will not talk a lot about what to do in lectures. I'll get a little later of how we could fill the lecture space, and perhaps. Most importantly, our understanding of how learning of student takes place has possibly clarified over the last 2 decades as well. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology aspect and the understanding of learning aspect, because that's important. Now, technology, from my perspective, for what I'm talking about, the most important thing is how it has changed the effort we have to make to present material outside the lecture. Remember what I said, traditionally we use the lecture as the vehicle to convey material. And I'm going to say, one of my main arguments is going to be, there are other ways which are easy to use, perhaps even better ways to convey material. And if we use them, we can use that to create space in the lecture to do something else. What to then do in the lecture is a different question. But firstly, to have the opportunity to have space in the lecture without sacrificing material, we need to figure out how do we present the material in other ways, perhaps outside the lecture. And that is where technology comes in. Of course, textbooks, I think all of us, and better and more inspirational lecturers than me, have failed to make students read textbooks in advance of lectures. So that's going to be very difficult unless textbooks change. And again, Alvin is going to talk about that. But you can ask other things, shorter things, more interesting things, students to prepare. You can have audio recordings, or you have, and that's sort of my personal choice, you can have sort of online clips, just so you have. So why is that not? All right. So I have to first go.
Issue with technology.
Yeah, easy. Here we go. Okay. First I have to go out of, just so you know, this was sort of inspired by, some of you may have seen Khan. Do you know what? So clearly technology has its. So how,
yeah, exactly. No, it's the whole window, right?
exactly, and it tells you that preparation is quite. Here we go. Okay, thank you. Can you just stay here so I can get back? So this.
You can put.
Yeah. So this has been.
Sorry.
So this has been inspired by Khan Academy. How many of you have seen Khan Academy videos? Not many of you. Basically, it is very easy to basically record videos like this. I switched off the sound. You really don't want to hear me talk to this, but you can present. It's like a whiteboard where you write on a whiteboard and you record it and you talk to it, and you present that to students online, and they can see that. Okay, it's like someone records a lecture, just not with the opportunity for students to ask, but with the opportunity for students to hold and rewind. Okay, which they don't get in lectures. So a lot of material I present like this, and it's really easy to actually produce these yourself. You need a little bit of technical kit, but most likely your department will be happy to help you with that. Can you now show me how to get back the main presentation?
Ralf, what's the name of the kit that you use?
I really, all you need is like they're very common now, a little desktop on which you can write, and you need a screen recording software. I use Camtasia, but there are many others. And then you need YouTube, or you can create MP4 files and upload them. Thank you very much. So now, in terms of understanding of learning, I think it's now well understood that sort of deep knowledge, which is really what we aspire most of our students to have, it's not passed on, but is constructed by students. We need students to actively engage with material to do that. Now, of course, already students do that. The good students, they go away after the lecture, they engage deeply with material, and therefore they get deep understanding. But I think it's supposed to be fair to say that not enough students do that, or not as many students as we wish. So in some sense, one aim of what we want to achieve is that we want to engage more students in that sort of deep learning. And what seems to be a consensus in a psychology of learning literature, that what it takes to get to this stage is some sort of active involvement or active learning from students. So a good summary you can find on Steve Draper's website of the learning theoretical background here. So this active learning, as I said, motivated students do that already. They challenge their understanding, they go deeply into material, they set themselves the task to link that material with already existing knowledge and create a synthesis on that. But usually it does not happen in a lecture. And my question is, why not? And I think there's no good reason why we couldn't use more of lecture time for this sort of activity. Of course, to do that, we need to be able to create space in the lecture, and I'll show you in a moment how I do that. Okay, so the aim is by moving elements of active learning into the classroom, we can perhaps engage more students with deep learning and therefore understanding a deeper understanding of our material. I linked here some reference, a paper by Freeman et al. That provides, in terms of STEM subjects, a lot of evidence that active learning in lectures is beneficial for learning. So, here are the two challenges. How can we create space in the lecture, and what should we do in the lecture? I'll talk more about the first one, and Humberto later will give an example of what to do in the second. So we need to think about the whole thing, not only the lecture. So if your colleague comes and just gives you the lecture notes, don't be satisfied. Okay, and ask, so what is the bigger picture? And if that colleague doesn't have any, then you create another one. So what do we want from students? Basically we want them in the end to apply their new knowledge to new contexts after combining it with previous knowledge. This, by the way, is one of the few useful things you can get from universities' manual of academic procedures. Right? But then we have to ask, if we want to achieve that, what are the tools we have at hand? Of course, we have lectures, tutorials, seminars, and reading, all the traditional tools. We also have group work assignments, online quizzes, podcasts, online clips. All, these last three are sort of new things we can grapple with. We also have things, for instance, at university we use quite a lot peer-assisted studies teams, roping older students into the learning process of younger students. And really you need to think about, you should start from a blank sheet really and ask, okay, what is best done in lectures, what's best done in tutorials, and so forth. And shouldn't automatically say, okay, let me convey material in the lecture and then do everything else through the other channels. So, of course, the biggest challenge in here is that all of these, in the end, require students to engage with this. I'll show you how easy or difficult that is in a moment. Now, here is a summary of what I already said. Do not use the lecture content as the definition of your course content, because that really puts the shackles on. Okay, but as soon as you get rid of this, as soon as you realize I can present examinable material in other ways, then really all of a sudden you get opportunities. Okay, but of course the communication to students of that point is very difficult and very important, because they will see in many other course units that this is still the way how it works, and perhaps their older peers will have explained to them, just learn what's in the lecture and that's fine. So the communication to students is very important. So what I want to do is nothing else but to topple the lecture, which sits nicely and snugly on that throne, to topple it and find its rightful place. So, what do I think is best achieved? Let me show you this. So this is an example of one course, how I tell students the lecture is only a small part of your thing, okay? This is a week of material, worth a week of material. I teach econometrics. I give them some learning objectives, which, by the way, students find extremely helpful, because they are like revision questions at the end, which tells them, have I really understood that? I didn't realize until students told me how useful they were. Then I give them quite clearly, I say, before you come to the lecture, this is what I expect you to do. Here, these are links to online clips, but it could be some reading. It shouldn't be a whole textbook chapter, because they ain't going to do it. The question is also, are they going to do this one? I have some evidence on that. Then something happens in the lecture. Yeah?
Is this a Google document that you can send to the students?
No, that's on Blackboard.
Okay.
It's on Blackboard, on their Blackboard site. Yeah. Then there are lecture notes, which they can download. They're incomplete. I know you have 1 minute, right? Then I tell them what to do after the lecture. Okay. Now, let me jump over that. The important thing is here, you need to motivate students to actually do that. Okay, it's no good in just saying, oh, okay, it would be nice if you read that before. And then if you realize students don't do it, you go into the lecture and just repeat what's in that material. You can't do that. Then you've lost. You have to say, this is examinable and not presented in any other way. Now, I have some usage statistics of how many students look at my clips. Okay. Here is the lecture. That's a midterm test. Oh yeah, my time is up. Sorry, I'm finishing. So you can see that usually there is a peak of them looking at the clip at around or before the lecture. It's not very easy to motivate students. So I haven't managed that to my full satisfaction. More students prepare than previously, I'm pretty sure. Okay, it's about 30–40% who do. But it's not really satisfactory. That's just similar pictures, just for different weeks. So what this tells me, I have a really important job in motivating students to do that. Okay, but I think if you do things like Humberto will describe in the lecture, I will have a much easier way of motivating students to actually prepare my material, rather than if you just in lectures convey pretty standard material. And let me finish with this, such that Humberto gets his time. Okay. Humberto, I'm afraid you'll possibly need... I can't help you now.
So let's see. We go here. No, I think it's fine. Go here. Okay. First of all, thank you for attending this session. Since time is short, let me go straight to the point. So what I presenting here is really an experience. It's something we have done, and I think it's something we should keep doing, is trying more and more experience and sharing them. And that's the way we will learn what are the new things to do. So let me give you a general view of what we have tried to accomplish with this experience, and it's captured by this well-known Confucian saying that it was introduced to me by actually Rosemary Nagel, that says, a lot of people have heard about this. It's tell me and I forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I understand. Okay, and that's really the idea. So it's how to get the motivation of the students. I think it's really, we need to involve them into the classroom. So there is another saying that it's much less known, that it says, enjoy teaching your class and you will have happy students. Basically because that's, I thought about it yesterday, okay? But it gives a good point. So when we think about classes, what everybody tells you is you have to prepare a class so students will enjoy the class. And that's true. The students have to enjoy the class. But you have to enjoy teaching. You are going to be teaching this sometimes not once, but more than once the same year. And you will teach this class for several years. So when you prepare a class, you have to think, at least, so this is what I have in mind, you have to think not only that your students will find it interesting, but you actually will find it interesting to teach. Okay? So for that, so it's important to design your course so that it will be interesting to teach not once, but repeatedly. Okay? So we found in experiments a way to do this. So what I want to present is this experience of using experiments in teaching that we have used at UPF, in Pompeu Fabra, and the idea is, well, we hope that we can discover or recover the joy of teaching. So the question mark is because there's no guarantee. So this is a teaching experience that started in 2008, and we used experiments to teach principles of microeconomics. Okay, it can be used. So I use them teaching game theory as well, and the other applications. But let me focus on this one in particular. And we had a triple objective. So the first one was to engage, to motivate our students. Second, to emphasize active learning, and I see that the reference to Freeman is very popular, so it was in Ralf's presentation as well. And thirdly, we want to maintain rigorousness and higher standards. And there is a risk here. So with all the gamification and so on, I have, this is a personal thought, I have some doubts on whether we can move into really moving too much into the games and forgetting a little bit about rigorousness. Okay, so let me, before I present the application, let me tell you what's the difference between experiments as a teaching tool and experiments in research. So I see them as two very different things. So the first thing is the objective of experiments as a teaching tool is to replicate a known result. We don't want to discover new things. However, many times the experiments don't work in the class. Actually, all those failures to replicate the result are very useful, and they help to create, and this is where you start getting some joy in teaching, because they are novelty in every class. So you have to be alert, you have to be aware. So there is, you can learn about incentives, about attention, that is very related to incentives, about market power. So you see that you have a small group of people in the class, even though you want to replicate a perfectly competitive market, sometimes they manage to agree among themselves and the result doesn't come out. But that's really a great opportunity to introduce about instruments to defend competition, or about the idea that the difference between a perfectly competitive market and the idea of market power. The second point is that in experiments as a teaching tool, manipulation and intervention is no problem. And I think this is something that not been, actually let me go to the third point. So the third point, and I think this is the important one, is you don't need to be an experimental researcher. So I haven't written any paper on experiments, with an experiment, so far. So I don't discard it, but haven't found the right question. Okay? But you don't need to be an experimental researcher in order to use experiments in the classroom. And actually, connected to the second point, not being an experimental researcher actually helps you with the idea of saying, well, if I intervene to speed up the result, actually that helps the dynamics of the class and so on. Okay? So let me just skip this one and go directly to the experience in UPF. So very briefly, so we have, so this is a course first year, first quarter, and let me just go back here. So we have done it. So the theory class, I'm not gonna talk too much about it because it's the depending subject. But in the seminars that we have from 25 to 60 students when we run the experiments, and we have had seminars that goes from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, and we've done it in several languages. So the methodology, and this is where I want to put some more emphasis, is we have two types of classes, seminar and lectures, and the structure is we always start with experiment. So the first day of class is how the dynamic of the class, what's the instructions for the class. The second is just an experiment. So before the experiment, they have to read a description and do some warm-up exercises. So this description is one page and a half. During the seminar we start with a quiz, which actually tests whether they have read, and that's to create the incentives in order to read this experiment, and then run the experiment. During the experiment and after the experiment, we direct the students to discover and discuss the results. Okay? Then after the seminar, we give them data based on the experiment, and they have to work on that data. We haven't reached the lecture yet. Now, once they have a struggle on how to find or how to do this homework and how to, where they have problems and where they don't, then we go and do the theory class. The theory class solve, hopefully, some of the problems they found here, and more importantly, generalizes the result to a continuum of agents and so on and so forth. Okay, so finally, in what we do in the last later is to collect the homework, and we go back to this structure. So we have an experiment, we have working on text and constructive exercises, and then we have the theory class. Okay, and then we collect the homework and we go back. So we have experience, we have research and discover all by students, and finally we provide the information. I think this structure is what's really engaging. So since I have no time, let me just escape the things of how incentives are important and let me give you the resources we have. So what we wanted to create here is really a pact that people can use in order to apply and use this way of teaching. So there is a textbook and constructive homework. We have online resources. We have Excel files that simulate the experiments, and we have a lot of additional material for the lecture that I don't want to put too much emphasis because it's a traditional lecture. But the thing I want to talk is that we used, so for the experiment, actually, the experiment we run it with cell phones, with mobile devices. We use ClassX that has, I think, 4 important features. First, it's free. Second, it's shareable. So you can use experiments already there and use the database from the repository. Then it's flexible in the sense that you can modify these existing experiments and adapt it to your own circumstances. And finally, it has real-life feedback between the instructor and the students and between the student to student. Okay? So I had an example, but I see I have no time to go through it. So I was planning to go through it, but I was too ambitious. So let me just show you what students see. And that will take 1 minute, and I'm done. Okay? So this is an experiment where it's a labor market. There are employers and there are workers. So as a student, you get in your phone either a personal information that says you are an employer and these are your characteristics, or an information screen that shows that you are a worker and you have a reservation wage and you have a specific code. So then students, they actually in the classroom, they go to the market, which means the middle of the classroom. They start to interact among them, and when they find an agreement, when they agree on a particular wage, then the worker provides the code to the employer. They write the wage, and they send the contract. That contract goes to the main screen, and it's projected so everybody is seeing each one of the transactions that it's happening in each one of the experiments. So at the end of the experiment, and these are different rounds we have done, you can get statistics of the experiments, and you actually get a description of what's happening, what has happened during the experiment. Okay, so and this is live during the experiment. So at the end, you get the data to do the homework, and you get the solutions. You get a spreadsheet where you put this data, and automatically all the homework gets generated. And the idea is to facilitate, because one of the hard things is really to adjust to these new systems. Okay. So summary, we have so experiments engage students and facilitate understanding of abstract concepts. Running experiments is not enough. So I think it's important to discuss before, during, and after the experiment. And experiment must be accompanied by tasks that make students analyze and think about the main findings of their own. Okay? And I think experiments introduce a dynamic that keeps the professor alert and makes teaching a fun experience. So it goes very fast. But if you want to talk about anything, so I have some thoughts that I can about the general lecture, but I'll skip that. So if you want to talk to me or contact me, so I would be more than happy to talk about this experience or any other one. Okay, thank you. Yes.
It's on the desktop, I think.
It should be there. Oh, yes.
That's
Okay.
So when I was doing my PhD, I worked as a computer programmer, but this technology really frightens me, so I'm not going to... No. Ah, that's it. Great. Okay. So yes, thanks very much for coming to this session early on a Friday after a late night, and that's sometimes in the UK we would call this a graveyard slot. Anyway, I'm going to talk about content, and let me just start actually by saying that one of the ways of capturing what Ralf and Humberto were talking about, the sort of narrative that I use to describe that, is that we used to put everything into the lecture, and we didn't really think about the complementarity between the time before the lecture and the time after the lecture, and how the lecture time can be used to leverage student interaction and involvement before and after the lecture. And I think once you start thinking about the time of education as just a long stream where there are lots of sorts of interventions and opportunities for interaction with students, teaching becomes very, very different, I think. And so what am I talking about here? Well, active learning is quite difficult to implement, and motivation is key here. So Ralph's already talked about some of the difficulties involved in getting students to be active learners. And in a way, and I've been having conversations with Margaret about this over the last year, in a way, we've always all been trying to flip our lectures, because we've always said to students, we want you to read and prepare before you come to the lectures. But it never really worked, and the reason it never really worked is because it was a kind of weird contract, because we were saying to students, we want you to read this chapter, and then we were going into the lectures and then regurgitate. Oh, sorry. What Ralf had described here. So let me just ask, how many people are familiar with the term of flipping? Most of you, not all. So flipping a lecture is roughly what Ralf described here, where you might make resources such as videos, or the kinds of activities that Humberto was describing for students to engage with before the lecture, in order to remove material from the lecture so that when you go into the lecture situation, you've got a lot more time, and what you're doing in the lecture then is using that prior material and activating it and asking questions about it. Students might be doing problems, they might be playing games, that they're much more active rather than sitting and listening passively. It's called flipping because the content is kind of flipped. So the students are doing the work before, in a sense, rather than during the lecture. So in a sense, we've all been flipping lectures because we've asked students to read material before the lecture and then come to the lecture prepared. But the contract has always been rather odd in the sense that we've tended to then go through the chapter we just asked them to read beforehand. And actually, it's a kind of failure of expectations, really. So we're asking students to prepare something, but of course, then we're saying, well, you didn't really need to prepare it anyway, because we're going to go through it in any case. So it was almost as if we were expecting them not to have read it. But technology makes this kind of flipping much more exciting and much more possible. There are difficulties, I think, in implementing active learning. There's a fixed cost investment involved in developing videos and quizzes and things like that, which you may want students to engage with before the lecture or even during the lecture. There's some evidence by an anthropologist that was reported in the Times Higher Education supplement recently, Lauren Herkins at Carnegie Mellon, that sometimes lecturers actually find it difficult to change their ways of teaching because they're worried about the fact that it might go wrong. Right? It's a deep sort of deep embedded fear of embarrassment in front of students, and I think actually there may be something in that. When I speak to my colleagues, I think there's an element of that. The other difficulty is that sometimes when you ask students to do exciting things in lectures or before lectures, they often don't do it. And sometimes that's because we haven't aligned our assessment properly to those activities. So, for example, we run a video challenge in Bristol where we get students to make videos. One of the first things they do when they arrive at Bristol is they make a video about an aspect of Bristol, and they have to throw light on that aspect using the economics that they're learning. And we've found it difficult to get students engaged in that. It's teamwork, it builds quite complex skills for the students. But we found it difficult to get the students involved simply because it wasn't being assessed. It didn't contribute. Nothing in the assessment drew on that experience. And that's a case of a misalignment between the assessment and the activities. So we could do a whole talk here about how you align assessment, but I'm not going to do that. Another problem is departmental inertia. Sometimes you want to change things, but your department doesn't let you, right? That's another, that's another problem we all have to face. The one I'm going to concentrate on in the next 10 minutes or so is the last one here, which is that sometimes the content itself is not conducive to exciting, engaged, active learning. And it may be time that we need to start thinking about how the stuff that we're teaching should be made a little bit more exciting for students. And Margaret mentioned that I run an organisation called the Economics Network, and for this is the website is just economicsnetwork.ac.uk. By the way, we have an international conference every 2 years, and the next one is in September on the 6th to the 8th in UCL in London, University College London. And one of the things we do there is we train lecturers in how to use these active techniques. We've been doing this for many, many years. I don't know, maybe 15 years or something like that on an annual basis. And this is a program of a 2-day event that we run. And I won't go through this, but you can see, you know, what making large group teaching more engaging. There's the last session there on the second day, games and media in teaching. And most of these sessions are actually about how can we activate students to do things in lectures. And what we found is actually it's quite difficult to get this working. So people come and they say, that's great, fantastic ideas, and I can see that this would work. But they find it difficult to actually implement this when they go back to their own universities. And so in recent years, I've been kind of thinking that sometimes the problem might actually be with the fact that delivery and content are not so separate as we might think. It's not that you can take any content and make it active. You probably can, but some content is easier and more naturally aligned to active teaching and group work and doing things than other types of content. So does economics lend itself to active learning? Well, if you look at it, on the surface, economics is one of the best subjects, really, that you might want if you wanted to do active learning. Let's just have a look at some of these ideas. It's a social science that has something to say about pressing issues facing the world. Remember, one of the problems with active learning is you need to get students motivated to do work beforehand or outside the situation where you're talking to them. And so motivation is really important. Economics asks some of the most motivating questions of any subject. We have some things to say about climate change, inequality, development, unemployment, growth. The list could go on. These are the kinds of things that students come to economics wanting to understand. So they're already motivated to understand them. These are big, big questions. It's empirical. To a certain extent, it's a doing subject. It's competency-based. And so it invites data work, project work, students looking at data, trying to make sense of it. It's very active in that sense, or at least it ought to be. It uses games and experiments in research, as Humberto has talked about, to find out new things. And so the activity of games and experiments is already inherent in the subject in a fundamental way. It has gripping historical narratives. And in fact, Schiller's presidential address this year to the American Economic Association was all about how narratives sometimes have real effects on the economy, but the importance of narratives around depressions and in historical understanding of economics is paramount. It's current. It fills the news. It's all around us all the time. When you look at this on the surface, you think, well, this is a subject made for active learning. And yet it doesn't really happen. There are intellectual debates that should excite students as well. And then when you look at the textbooks, you find they start, this is a first-year textbook. Well, we use this as a first-year textbook. In some places it's used as a second-year textbook. But if you look at sort of principles textbooks, they don't deal with those big issues at the beginning. And you kind of think, well, actually, that's quite demotivating, really. So we could be talking about climate change, inequality, development, unemployment, the great crash of, the Great Depression, the crash of 2008. But what we do is we say, well, students come with all those motivations, then we say, well, let's forget all of that for the moment, 2 or 3 years perhaps, and let's concentrate on this rarefied abstract world where everything is perfect. And so, when you look at these books, this is Varian, the market, budget constraint, preferences. We go through these very, very abstract models which don't really speak to those really big things that could be motivating in economics. If you look at the end of the book, there's some interesting stuff. Game theory, behavioral economics, all the recent research that really kind of might excite students, it's all there right at the end. You might never get there in a first year course, right? And it's not just Varian. There's Mankiw, there's Krugman and Wells. You could take more or less any of the major textbooks and they look very, very similar. And you could do games, you could make these rather exciting, but you're starting from a pretty poor base, really. You're trying to take what's kind of a dry exposition of economics into something really exciting. What if you started differently? You start with a 1,000-year history of GDP per capita, and you get students to look at the data. This is what research does, right? You look at data, you look at phenomena, you say, well, there's something interesting here that I want to understand. And when you look at this, students automatically ask questions. This is the GDP per capita of a number of countries from the year 1000, or as far back as it could be constructed, to around 2000. And the obvious question is, why does all of a sudden, in the late sort of in the 18th, late 19th century, all of these things just shoot up enormously? And why do some countries happen before other countries? Why are India and China at the back of that graph? And so these are the kind of motivating ways into the subject that we could be using. You could then, focus the students' minds on various aspects. And you, in Core, which is the text that I'm going to talk about, there are a number of these kind of hockey stick graphs which make students wonder, well, what is actually going on here? It excites students, so we're not asking students to forget, to suspend their disbelief and forget about all the exciting stuff. We're actually inviting them to ask lots and lots of questions. So wages in London, they have the same shape. Northern Hemisphere temperature, carbon dioxide emissions look like this as well, the speed at which news travels. Something happens late in the 19th century or in the 18th century in some subjects that students want to know about. And that's the beginning of the Core textbook. And if you don't know about Core, it's a new textbook that's been developed by an international group of writers around the world. It's an international production. And it's a free online textbook. And if I have a moment a bit later, I'll show you the website. But you can see that the beginning of this text looks very, very different. And it starts with data, with hockey sticks, and it talks about historical problems. It talks about the Industrial Revolution and those graphs that we just saw, and then it gets onto scarcity, work, and choice a bit later on. But even in that chapter on scarcity, work, and choice, if I get there, I will show you that actually it uses the same method. What's going on here with this content? Well, it's the ordering. The process of ordering the content has been inverted. So the traditional method, this is a bit of a caricature, but the traditional method that we saw in Varian, Mankiw, and Krugman and Wells is a theoretical exposition of economics. That's quite comfortable for most of us. We build up theories step by step, and then we get onto examples later on. So in other words, the motivating stuff comes at the back, and the demotivating stuff comes first. It's not a good mix, really, for activating interest in economics. It requires this suspension of disbelief. Just stick with us for a while, and then we'll get on to the interesting questions. And then with this kind of exposition, if you leave out steps, because you're building up a model from first principles and then layering it on and on and on until you get to the full model, you can't really leave any steps out. Because if you leave steps out, it creates confusion in students. It emphasizes ground covering. You want to get through everything. And so active learning is difficult because the exposition is very abstract. What does Core do? Core actually mimics the research process. And I don't know, those of you who saw the plenary at the end of yesterday would have noticed that the method of exposition there was really interesting. You start with an empirical phenomenon, and you say, well, actually, there's something here that current theories or understanding doesn't really capture. Total factor productivity doesn't really explain certain recessions. So what do we need to do? Well, let's think about whether we can construct a model or a theory to try and explain that phenomenon that is currently unexplained. And then we work towards the model, and then we test it against the theory. That's what motivates researchers. But when we go to students, we sometimes kind of forget that process, and we just give them the fully worked out theory that emerges at the end of that process. So they don't get any of the excitement of seeing the data and the questions and the motivation and the working out and then the testing. They just see this kind of packaged model at the end, right? Perfect competition model. Took years to develop that, supply and demand, elasticity. But we're kind of, in a sense, just stopping them engaging with all that motivation. So here we go. So what does core do? We start with historical and real-world narratives. The data is in every single chapter. There's data at the beginning. Data sets are all available for students to see. All of the motivation comes through real case studies of climate change, inequality, development, growth, all the things I talked about earlier, the Great Recession. And then the theories that are developed with a purpose and an explanation in mind. And that's the important thing about theories. Theories don't describe the world, but if you're told a theory in abstract, sometimes as a beginning student, you might think, actually, that's the way the world works. But if you begin with the empirical phenomena and you develop a theory in order to explain, you realize that theories are actually quite purposive. They're useful for a particular purpose, and they might not be useful elsewhere. That in itself is an important lesson for students to learn. And then the details of the models here, you get to afterwards. You start with the big problems, narratives, you look at what theories might explain it, and then you fill in the theoretical details afterwards. When you do it that way around, it's almost backwards, right? When you do it that way around, you can leave out steps. You don't have to cover all the material. And so some of the material, the theoretical details, the mathematics, is all in kind of modular components in core, in what are called Leibniz's and Einstein's separate sections. And so it creates space. It creates space in your lectures because you're not having to cover everything to do things like games, for example. So content and delivery are very kind of intermingled, very interdependent. So order matters. I won't go through this again. But I'll just give you a very, very quick example to finish off with. So this is chapter 3 of core. And chapter 3 of core is actually quite theoretical because it develops the labor-leisure model, the indifference curve constraint optimization model that is in all textbooks. But we start with that data set, and you can just about see it on the left-hand side. That's real wages of London craftsmen, I think. But it rises in that kind of hockey stick shape. And so the question, I don't know whether you can read this or not, but here at the bottom, it tells you right at the beginning, these are the learning objectives, that we're going to develop a model to try and explain what's going on there and try and explain why certain countries reacted in different ways to these wage increases. Some took, like the US, worked a lot more than France, who took a lot more of the gains in leisure, right? How do we explain that? So it says at the bottom there that we're going to use the model to explain the data, not just that we're going to develop an interesting model. And then that's what happens. So we develop this model, we go through income and substitution effects. And by the way, when you motivate students in this way, you find that actually you can enter into theory at a much higher level of sophistication because the students are motivated about the explanation. But when you're trying to motivate them with curves and diagrams and equations, it's harder, it's much harder. And so we can develop income and substitution effects really quite quickly because students just want to know. What does explain this data? So we use it to explain the change over time from 1900 to 2013. We use it to try and explain what might be, why there might be a difference between the responses to wage rises in various countries across the world. Is there any time to show the website quickly or not? 30 seconds, okay. I'll quickly get this up, although I'm not that optimistic about finding it. It's a race against time, but I can't even find my cursor.
Perhaps we should get you to put this on the website.
Yeah, why don't we start questions and then I will just put the website on as we're talking, so people can see it.
We're obviously being recorded for the EEA website, but perhaps we should be thinking about some supplementary material which is going to give you additional guidance and details. Right, questions?
I would like to ask Humberto a question. There's a phase where the experimental results, and when you look at these results, try to think about what
So that's probably a hard question. Usually the motivation we try to give them is, so there are two types of motivation. One is to tell them that this is the best they can do if they want to learn. So they have to discover first. So that's sometimes wishful thinking. The second motivation is to give them, so if you can manage to organize the course, to give them a lot of time between the experiment and the lecture, and very short time between the lecture and the time you collect the homework. Which means that would be the ideal structure of the course. So if they realize that they will not have time to do the homework after the lecture because they will have to turn it in soon enough, then that creates an incentive in order to work on the homework beforehand, and then just finishing up and solving the doubts they left or the empty cells after the main lecture.
So you are each individually involved into active learning, but I was wondering, in the case of UPM, it's even a team endeavor. I was wondering whether adoption of active learning technique is a top-down or bottom-up process. Is it about just convincing each individual lecturers and each of them adopting, moving towards active learning, or is there some are there things that institutions can do to encourage?
I mean, in our case, it's a bottom-up. So it's really individual, and I think that's how changes most of the cases happen. So it's really individuals who are especially motivated, who start introducing the changes. And what we try to do is to create a package so it's easier to adopt by other instructors. What I think is that institutions, I don't know if they can force the change, but they could really facilitate the change. And there are many ways they could facilitate the change. So one, I think it's been mentioned before, it could be to move away from collecting time, presential time in the classroom, as the way to measure how much effort the instructor does. And that's actually
there are a couple of things institutions could do and are starting to do, actually. One is there's Leeds, for example, has started to build lecture theatres where instead of seats being like this, they're in kind of almost in groups, so they're on the website. You can see they're really quite interesting. And when you walk into a lecture like that, you kind of think, well, actually, at some point during this hour, I should get the students to talk to each other. And another university, La Trobe University in Melbourne, has got rid of lecture in the business faculty. They've got rid of lectures and seminars and classes, and everything is now just taught in groups of 40. And there, aside even from the signalling, if you say to somebody you've got to do a lecture, it tells them sort of that they should be talking at an audience. Here, it's not. If you've just got a group of 40, it makes it much easier to run games, to enter into dialogue with those students. So there are those kinds of things that, and facilitating technologies such as Camtasia, polling software, learning catalytics, those kinds of things.
So I want to add something to this. Firstly, what you said with the technology, that's very important, and that can be done on the departmental level. So we try that to do. What we also do on the departmental level is, I currently have responsibility for teaching, and me and my colleague, we have meetings with every lecturer about their course once a year, and we ask each colleague of this question: what's your lecture for? And that doesn't trigger wholesale change from one year to the next, but we can already see that some colleagues are adopting little elements, and that's something which I would actually really like to add. Is you can certainly, I didn't start from one year to the next and totally changed my teaching. I started by taking one or two topics and realized, say, instrumental variables estimation, which I was teaching. I said, I really want to talk about a long example here, I don't have usually time in the lecture because I do all the theory. So I decided for this lecture, just take all the theory out and either put an introduction in front of the lecture and the details behind. And then I had a whole hour to talk about just one example of instrumental variables estimation right from the beginning, from the motivation. And it was awesome. It was great. It was so much fun. I don't know whether it was as much fun for the students, but for me, it was what Humberto said. It was just great. And so that's how I started. And then I realized, I do a little bit more. Yeah.
I just want to add to Humberto. So Humberto and I, we teach an introduction with always experiment lecture. Okay. But I actually offered my colleagues that I come for one seminar in that course and teach one experiment for that particular course. So voting, we do a voting experiment or bubble. And I've actually done that in New York and Columbia more than in my own university. But now I teach very little, and I really plan to tell 3 or 4 people, because I saw that I talk to our students in the 4th year and say experiments, and they say experiments, and then one says the fish. The fish, that was fun. Yeah, and so they don't remember enough. Yeah, I mean they don't know that they don't remember. They learn malfunction by playing. That's what they don't know. So there are many little ways that we can help our colleagues, and then we experiment has also become more important for the institution. Yeah, if we are more involved in other people's teaching. Yeah. So, but in principle, what Humberto says, and Humberto himself is not an experimenter, anybody can do what Humberto does. Yeah, because there's, I mean, the Bergstrom book is amazing. Yeah.
Just to say, I am trialing at LSE, so just on one course, the big intermediate micro course, getting much more active learning, whereas where the issue, as I perceive it, is how do I get my teaching assistants to change in that way, because that's key to doing it. And I'll tell you in a year how that's gone. Question there?
Yeah, I was just wondering in terms of the views of the students. So here we've been talking more about like, okay, we have to motivate the students, but how, I mean, would it ask for such changes and how to show them that it's not a threat to their study? Because Ralf is about free time. I mean, how is it a threat to your free time? Because if you move the learning outside of the classroom, for them they say, okay, we have less time to meet friends, party, whatever. So how, I mean, how strategically can we present to them so that they understand that it's important for them to flip the
I don't know how this works across Europe, but in the UK, for example, there is this understanding that a credit point of teaching amounts to 10 hours of study. And when you do the maths, that means that actually students ought to be studying for 40 hours a week, and self-reported surveys run by, for example, the Higher Education Academy suggest that in social sciences, students are studying for about half of that time in the social sciences. So there is an understanding that students should be working outside, and the lecture is not, you can't just come to the lecture time because that might only be a few hours a week, but I think, Ralf, you did some work looking at how students felt about some of this, didn't you?
It was actually on introducing some active learning into tutorials, and it was really interesting. We asked them sort of 2 questions. We had sort of one style of tutorial in semester 1, which is very traditional. The tutor went to the board and solved the questions which students were supposed to have solved beforehand, but didn't because they knew they would get the solution. And another type of tutorial where they got some questions with solutions beforehand, but in the tutorial they got new questions unseen without solutions. They were meant to work in groups, and the tutor would just walk around and help them and just give them final solutions but not worked solutions. And we asked 2 questions. A, would you rather have the tutorials from the first semester or from the second semester, the more active learning ones? And the majority said, we'd really prefer to have the first semester ones. We also asked them the question, which type of tutorial helped you to learn better? And they overwhelmingly said the second semester one. So it's a little bit of, I think students understand what is good for them, but they have all these other competing pressures like sports, friends and stuff. And it's not easy to make them commit more to studies. But I think in the end, that given the evidence, that's what we have to try and do. But one danger is, of course, the impression that when you do this, have all this material, students think, I have to study for this much more than for other course units. I don't really think so, but I think that's how they often react. And then that, more worryingly, I think, because they don't sacrifice the time with their friends, they sacrifice time they study for other course units. And that's sort of slightly more worrying, I think. Yeah.
And you're right, we can use this graph to explain to them that they should be...
Question here.
Yeah, I have a suggestion and then a question. The suggestion is that, and maybe I look a little bit paternalistic in that, but I really enjoyed this session. But if we count the number of people who are here, this is a very selected
It's 19.
group.
You did.
So I think that if you ask all of us if they are interested in teaching or if they enjoy teaching, I'm sure that 100% of us, maybe 95% of us. So people are here because they like teaching and they want to learn how to teach in a different way. All the others are in the how to survive publication stuff. Okay? So it's a little bit unfair to put these two sessions in competition because also for young generation they are more interested in spite of the fact that we get paid for teaching, most of us, we are evaluated because of our publication time. So my suggestion is to put this session immediately after the presidential address, or even before, in order that all of us to get exposed to how can you improve a little bit your teaching, because it's not a problem just for the one that like teaching, but it's a problem for all others that maybe they start to like a little bit more. And I'm sorry, this was the paternalistic part.
Yeah, but we'll feed that into the program committee for next year.
That's great. Okay.
Can-
and the question is, in order to convince all our colleagues that this is effective, do you have really experiments on the fact that when you change the way you teach, students get better grade, or they participate more, they come to you, they send you letters, oh really I enjoyed your course. So did you did something on that through treatment and control groups in order to expose some students to the new way of teaching and others to the traditional one? Because I think this is something that will really convince not us, but all the others.
And we think this is in part what I'm trying to do at LSE.
Okay.
Obviously the idea would be an RCT at the same time, with students on the course, but politically this is very difficult. So we'll be doing other sorts of comparisons. I myself ran a class where I went to much more active learning, but what we did was, instead of having 15 students each for 1 hour, we had 30 students for 2 hours in order, because I think you do need more time, and it was wildly popular. Everything was, we ran a focus group, we got the evaluations and so on, and what they said, I hadn't used the word active learning at all, but what they all said was, we like this, and we like the fact that it motivates us to do the work. But the issue everyone is highlighting is, yes, I can do it, but can I do it with my TAs?
So firstly, before I have a response to your question, I'd like to add to your first comment, and that links to what someone asked, what can universities do? And since we are all not perfectly rational agents, but economists are pretty good in being on following the incentives, and you exactly described what the incentives for individual colleagues are. And therefore, what can universities do is can change the incentive structure for individual colleagues and make sure that promotions also happen on the basis of teaching contributions. And I can only speak for my own university. They have for years made noises about this being, more reflected, and indeed they're coming, first piece of evidence are coming through that colleagues are being promoted on the basis of that, and that's only once colleagues see that they will believe it. So I think that's an important aspect of what universities need to do. In terms of delivery, I'm an econometrician, and if I try to read the evidence in the sort of literature of teaching evaluations, this is rarely convincing when I apply my econometrician standards to that. And one reason for that is the reluctance of universities to engage, for instance, in randomized controlled trials, and they cite ethical concerns, which really beats me. Well, why can we do medical trials without, we should be compelled to do trials if we don't know what is better or not, and it's unethical to not do them, but for some reason it seems difficult to convince universities to do that. Although I suspect partly we have too much fear of asking. I had one little attempt at my university for a randomized control trial for a very little thing, and they said, yeah, do it. So I should become also myself more ambitious with that. But the existing state of evidence is such that our colleagues over there would not be convinced, I think. And it's a lot on gut feeling. Yes, we do, I'm sure Humberto and Alvin get brilliant student reviews, so do I, but I also got them when I still did traditional teaching. And it's a lot of what is done. It's the enthusiastic and therefore well-received teachers who do this stuff right now. And another question is, of course, how would that work if the less enthusiastic engage with this agenda?
We're actually out of time, but we do have the room for another 15 minutes. So what I would do is suggest that people who want coffee go. So that may be everybody, but if people want to come and continue an informal conversation, I think we're all happy to do so.
Let me just add one thing there. So we tried, at the beginning, to do this control group. We couldn't do it because the selection of students at Pompeu Fabra was not random. So actually students choose the groups, and they have different groups. They have changed that. But what I have is evidence and related to what Ralf was saying, evidence that students respond positively to any kind of effort made by professors. So this idea that the students are passive and they don't care, it's not true. The other thing is that this improve in the student evaluations. What we have is, we have for a long time and with a huge variety of instructors. So we have had 10 different, if I remember correctly, at least 10 different instructors teaching these courses, sometimes for the first time, people who have taught it for several years, people who were specialists in microeconomics, people who were not specialists in microeconomics, people who was visiting the university and taught it for one time. In all cases, the evaluations of the students regarding the experiments and the discussions in the experiments has been outstanding. So it has been way above the average of the department, and the average of the department is above the average of the university. So it's anecdotal evidence. We cannot control. We don't have a control experiment. So it's that's why I didn't show data. But I can show many of the quotations of students, and I think the most revealing quotation are students who come from other degrees, like there are people who do engineering and they've done a traditional introduction to microeconomics. They come here and they say, oh, I really was able to understand what microeconomics and all these models was about. So I have people who took the course several times, and they write explicitly that these really help into understanding. Now, from what I read in the literature about active learning, is that it's not that active learning. So I think the results about whether active learning gives you higher grades or lower grades is mixed. People get, and Freeman, the Freeman reference, I think it's relevant. What they all agree is that it gets much higher motivation and much higher happiness with the course and satisfaction. And that seems that the evidence is very robust. But that's from my readings.